Hey everybody, this is Dimitri from your studio. Thanks again for tuning in. This is the second live episode, and in this episode I want to talk about something very different than what I'm usually accustomed to, and it's something very small. Typically, I'm quite good at working out concepts at large scale, and my sister asked me to help design her home office. She's a wedding photographer, and she needed to have some nice place at home where she can work and also bring in potential or existing clients. But I do still want to talk about this project because the process of deriving the architecture, no matter how big or small your project is exactly the same. Right, so let's get started. One thing I would like to mention is that this is going to be two parts. So the first part, two parts in the same live stream. So in the first part, we're going to talk about the iteration and the process. And in the second one, I'm going to go through the Blender file and just show you how it's set up and talk mostly about the materials. So let's get started. Alright, so this is a small room. It's about 10 feet by 10 feet or 2.5 to 3 meters to 2.5 and 3 meters. Very tiny, and with any project, I usually start out with a sketch. A sketch could be as complex or as simple as possible. In this sense here, the sketch actually captures a lot of information about plants, about the desks. And this is mostly actually for my own good, to understand exactly what I think would work well in the space, but also to speak with the client, in this case my sister, about what she thinks about all the decisions. Now, no matter what the project is, again, the sketching is such an important part of, let me just adjust something here. That's it. Sketching is such an important part of the process. I cannot iterate this enough, and it's only something that I learned more and more as I gain more experience, even in 3D. I consider myself pretty proficient. What I wish I were more proficient in is sketching, because if I could sketch that much more, then I would need to do that much less 3D. Not that I don't love doing 3D, but as we all know, it's quite tedious. So now, back on topic. So that's the initial sketch where I talk about custom desks, display wall without portfolio. So as I mentioned, she's a wedding photographer. So if when she has clients coming in, we want to make them feel comforting with nice photos, different kinds of references, and be in an environment where they feel comfortable to trust somebody to take probably the most important pictures of their life. So yeah, after initial sketch, we started out doing a very simple rough layout, and as you can see again, this room is super small. We can basically fit a desk and a small couch, or so we thought. So after the initial process, we talked to her and I went and did a couple of sketches just to see what works well. And the two big elements are the couch and the desk. First, I was looking at some stock desks and couches. And then I was thinking, because the room is so tight, we have an opportunity to design something that works much better for the space. Excuse me. So this is the first 3D concept of this. And as you can see, it's very rough, but it was a starting point to start thinking about how the space could be organized and what we could lay out in here. So I don't consider myself an artist, a 3D artist. I wish I were much better at it. I am definitely a designer. However, I do use 3D for design, which is what I find is quite useful for. So as you can see, like any project, we start out quite simple, then sketch, and then start to refine and add more elements that we think could be useful and try out different ideas as well. Some, as you'll see, they work better than others, so we can go back and step back a step. So between here and here, you can see that I started adding some light posts. And because the space is so tight and because it is interiors, we really need to get a sense of the feel the space, which is where I do think I would jump in 3D a little bit earlier than I would in some other projects, some larger projects that require a bit more sketching, exploration and diagrammatic exploration before we jump to 3D. So knowing at which point you need to jump into 3D is also quite important. So again, this is a further refinement. As you can see, the colors get a little bit better, the mood. I keep adding some elements and doing slight tweaks and improvements. Now, the guys that do this all day, every day, they probably have all kinds of assets for interiors like vases, plants, chairs, sofas, books. I don't. And that process of finding all those elements was actually very long. And the next iteration is starting to think about other storage solutions and being able to organize some elements in the table, working with the light a little bit in there, putting in some of my own art. I love to do mandalas. I do them quite a lot, in fact. I don't have one behind me somewhere. I usually have them around home. I thought you could use one. Then also trying different angles and putting different plants in different places. See how that works. And yeah, it's all about testing and exploring different ideas. And then these are quite useful to communicate with the client, because most clients, they can't really visualize a space that well. So having some 3D really does help. All right. So because it is a small space and because VR is becoming so accessible, I also started doing some VR shots. So these are 360-degree render, one for the top eye, one for the bottom eye, which these days you can pop into any phone with the simplest thing like Google Cardboard or with an Oculus headset, Oculus Go, to understand what they look like. So again, with the 360-degree renders, there was constant refinement in the idea that helps the client get a better sense of the space. And also, it's easy to test ideas like, would an accent wall be useful to be blue, as you see here, or red, as we saw in one of the previous examples. So after the initial set of sketches went back on the board, after the initial set of 3D explorations, we went back and thought how we can still think about this in plan and organize that in a way that it makes sense. Again, it's very simple. There's two big elements and everything else is more or less decoration, but we do want to have a specific sense and feel the space. So again, once having explored a lot of what's going on in 3D in regards to the elevations, only then could I go back and sketch out proper 2D elevations with all the elements that I wanted in the right place. Like, for example, here's the wall next to the entrance, or we have the desk, a monitor where she can show, and that's a pop-out monitor where it moves on an arm, on an articulated arm, where she could show pictures. Finding the right size that works well with photo frames in which you can display different styles of photography is important in there as well. Having some elements for accents, for example, a chair. Actually, I have a lamp on it right now, but this is one of my chairs here. It's a very, if you are an architecture student from 15 or 20 years or prior to that, everybody used to sit in stools. So that's the kind of stools that we sat in. The desk is, of course, it's a sit-stand desk. I'm standing at the moment, as you can probably imagine. Trends are changing and everybody realizes how important it is to not stay in just one place. And moving on to the other elevation, again, it's very simple. We have a shelf with some decorative lighting and then a picture frame, or in this case, a glass frame, a mirror, that could help reflect and give a little bit more light, because the space is quite limited in light as well, because there's a big closet next to the window, so there's only one big window, so we need a bit of extra light. And then the other elevation is, again, we have a couple of shelves, a nice big picture frame, and underneath a series of showcase photographs that the client could feel comforting in, that this is the right person that they can choose with the most important pictures of their life. So this is a quick snapshot of the view progression. So what I'll do is I'll go through them quickly, and then I'll go back and sort of explain them, because after all, this is a bit more of an in-depth. So let's do it. That's the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and that's it with these. Okay, again, so this you've seen already. It's just starting out, getting a feel for the place, adding some extra details, adding some plants, understanding how the space works. What works is a composition. And again, composition is one element that it doesn't matter whether you're working in a small room like here or a massive project. It needs to work well with itself, with the project, and it needs to work well with the rest of the site. And then I wasn't happy with some of the plans that were going in that space here. Adjusting the exposure inside, and again, I have to mention how difficult this project was for me. It took a very long time to complete. I could have probably pumped out 4 big architectural concepts, rendered, finished, presented, as I did to this room, to get the exposure right, to get the lighting right, to start looking at the materials right, and assets. Assets took a very long time. And this process is again very iterative. It's important to try and test ideas, put them in here, and then if they don't work, go back to the drawing boards or keep adjusting them. So what I was doing is these are pretty proper renderings, even though they're still, I consider them sketch renderings. Each one of them, they take a significant amount of time to render, so I will do some changes. I'll leave them overnight, and I'll come back the next morning, after going to work, and then coming back in the evening. Then would I look at them and being able to critique them. In fact, let me see if I can pull it out. I did take a screenshot somewhere. Let me bring it over here. So this was, I was rendering before I joined. Whoops. The call, and I managed to render 40 minutes. And I think it looks like it's 40%. So yeah, this image would have taken 2 hours to render on 48 cores. 48 cores is quite a bit. Most people don't have 48 cores in their computers. And this is CPU, by the way. My GPU is GTX 1070, so it's not the best, not the most current. Probably a newer NVIDIA RTX 2080 Ti Super would be able to handle it a little bit better. But it does take a while, so we do need to factor in the time that it does to produce these. Okay, so this here was actually quite a nice image, which I thought is properly exposed, but it looks a bit dark, and we don't want it to be that dark. Maybe it needs a bit more artificial light. But then I went back and gave a bit more exposure to everything in there to brighten it up. Okay, so then I did the same thing for another series of images, but these were the 2 main angles that were important to focus on. And as you see, then I looked at some other ones, but again with the exposure, because it was so dark, it took a while to get it right, and I'm still not quite sure it looks right again. Maybe I should give this to a proper artist once I'm done designing it. Okay. So view 2, I'll do again a quick and then a slow run through it. So first the quick ones, and then going back and talking a little bit more about the changes. So I really like red as an accent wall, but apparently that's not good when you have clients, especially when they're talking, when you want them to be calm and relaxed. So then we tried blue, and in the end we went with something that's a little bit white and tried to put accent baseboard around. But as you can see, once I had an idea of what the composition of the elements was from the elevations, then they went back and we started to put them in here. Now we have a little jungle in the side with a nice light. I think that's probably one of the nicer elements, and in fact I really quite like it with blue, but in the end the client requested to go with something a little bit brighter. And this is a closet where she can store her photography kit, and we've put glass in there so we can reflect and make the space feel a bit larger. And also it helps when you're sitting here and you're a potential client, you look at some beautiful photographs around, you look at beautiful photographs on the screen as well, and you see yourself here with your husband and you're like, oh yeah, maybe I look that good as well, great. Again, this is with the correct exposure, which looks good for daylight and even the context that you see outside, which is just a 2D image. It reads well, but the interior feels a little bit dark and dingy. And that's the final shot. Just have a sip of water. Okay, so then I did a series of other views, and as you'll see in the 3D file in just a second, there was a series of views. It's a very small space, but we gotta make it look right. So with these ones, I found them even more tricky to expose it. For example, you see here that camera feels a little bit too fake for the lighting situation because I had to bump up the exposure quite a bit. And the other element that I found quite challenging is putting some images on a screen that look like a screen and not a photograph. And then of course we always try to push the artistic elements a little bit more, so I try to do depth of field. Again, by no means the best images out there, but they do demonstrate a process, and we're talking mostly about the process here for architectural design. Okay, so let me jump in the Blender file and I'll show you around with what's going on. Excuse me. Now this was done in Blender 2.7, 5, 6, something like that. And you can always tell with the collections that come in. I always open these files in Blender 2.8. In fact, if you ever come across it, well, I don't want to do it with this file. I'll open a new one. But anyways, there's an option that says you can load the settings or disregard them. So if I come out, so that's the file setup. That's the street outside with some picture buildings, a light, a sun, fairly strong sun. It's got 3000 power strength. I'm not using any units, so let me see what units. Oh, actually I am using Imperial units. Yeah, this project is in the US. So the sun is a power of 3000, and then inside there's a little corridor and then the actual room, and the room is quite simple. I modeled the doors, so let's start with the inside out. So I believe I got this from a collection of assets from Blender Market. It was nice because the frame was a little bit more detailed than you would get in even Archipack, which is what I usually use. In fact, this cornice was modeled with Archipack. This was also the top one. It was, I can't remember, but it was either something that I bought off of Blender Market or something that I did on my own. See, I can tell you how, by the way that it's made. Okay, so if it's a curve, yeah, so I probably made this. But it's very simple. You just start with an element, with a cornice, with a curve, and then we sweep around onto another curve. curtains I'm no good at, so I always find these. I've got this from Chauffeur. These came from Archipack. The window was modeled in Archipack as well. And then looking at some of the bigger elements, these came from, I think it was from BlendSwap, which is, if you don't know it, it's the free place where you can find models for Blender. But the quality is not excellent, so you have to look quite well to find something that's of good quality. Now I did find some assets from furniture brands stores. So I think this is a No chair, and if you go to like one of the websites, for example like IKEA or No, or even type of product, chances are you're going to get a CAD model or even a 3D poly model that you can then use for your assets. If not, somebody's definitely modeled it somewhere, in many cases free instances. In fact, I did have to model this bench, this desk, which is an IKEA desk that I couldn't quite find the right model of. And then the plugs came from a pack as well. And then, yeah, you know, laptop I didn't model, all the plants, books, stuff that's happening on here, camera, I found that from somewhere as well. Table also, chair, sofa. And there's a picture frames again. A lot of these assets, they come from Chauffeur. And then I also modeled some of these in there. So yeah, with this picture frame there was something else in there and I just went and replaced it. So let's go and take a look at how some of these elements are modeled. Now the first thing to start with, which is quite important, is looking at the wall material. Now it's something that we don't really consider. That's actually, in my opinion, very important. And yeah, let's take a look at how this is built. So I have, this is a custom node that I use for scale. And then I have a noise texture and a wall bump that came probably from Polygon. And the whole idea is that we always have a little bit of bump. Let me see if you can see it here. Probably not too well. But the surfaces, they're never completely smooth. And that's one element that always helps out realism. Now, to be able to actually see that in Eevee, it's a little bit challenging because again, this file wasn't really prepared for Eevee. So let's see if we can render it out. Now, I'll probably need to be inside of the building. I'm just going to turn off the interior files, or rather layers, because they're the ones that have a lot of heavy geometry. So we can start understanding what's actually happening on the inside. Now the trouble is that they also have some of the lights. So it could take a little bit longer for them to render. But anyway, so yeah, wall is the most important material because a little bit of bump goes a long way to help add a sense of the actual wall, because they're never completely flat. The next thing I did was model these custom shelves with a small light. The idea is that we have like a little thin strip of LED light that creates a nice underlay for illuminating, for creating accent light without adding way too much harshness. Oh, I know what I can try. Let's see if we can use scene lights and scene world. So maybe we'll just try scene lights. Yeah, it doesn't quite work in Eevee, unfortunately. Oh, and the reason is that all these lights are mesh lights. Yeah, so one of the limitations of Eevee, as a side note, is that it doesn't work well with mesh lights as far as I know at the moment, so we need proper point lights, and everything in here was done with mesh lights. Okay, so moving on to the next material. It's the glass. Now, a lot of these materials, because on interior scale, everything is quite small, we can work with pre-made materials from libraries, like anything on Blender Market or any other place that you can find. I personally, I've bought too many of them probably, which have pretty decent textures, but I always end up needing to modify them quite a bit for the scale that I typically work in, which is quite a bit larger than this scale. This material I think came from one of the libraries that I use, and it's very simple. Let's see if I can select it. So we have a base diffuse color, dark wood flooring, then with the roughness I've added some scratches. And here we're adding the ambient occlusion. I mean, this is actually a very typical Blender material setup. So it's got all the channels that you would think, base color with some ambient occlusion added in there. We have the roughness, which is a map, and then the normal map, which comes in to create this base material. Let's go back inside of our room. Here we are. Now with these assets, these pre-made assets or pre-purchased assets, I don't really play with the materials too much unless it is to slightly make it lighter or darker or change the hue to add a little bit of variation and a little bit of materiality. So this is pre-principled shader, and if you don't know it, the principled shader is the new default way to add materials. And if you're getting new assets, they probably all work with it in one way or another, because it gives you the most physically correct assets and it simplifies the whole workflow because it has a series of inputs. But before that, we used to have to combine a series of different shaders together to create the same result. Now, unfortunately, a lot of people weren't satisfied with that, or their nodes got too complex, so everybody started putting different nodes together and made it quite hard to read because everything was in a group. So with materials, at least in my opinion, the simpler the better. Although I have one grass material that is not very simple, that I use all the time, that took me a very long time to set up. Okay, yeah, so then the file is organized with, it's got many layers, but the important ones is the shell, interior 1, which is a series of details, and interior 2 are the finer details. Then we have the cameras, and then we have the lights. And all of these elements, as you can see, they're quite similar. We have the simple lights, the drafts, the books, and then all the other elements to go in there. And I made these actually from a logo, which is nice metal engravings that I thought could work nice. Gustavo asks, why not use an HDRI in this scene to save render time? Actually, for interiors, HDRIs are not very sufficient because they're useful for having a lot of daylight and exterior light. And they typically add a lot more time for rendering because I'm not sure exactly what the math is, but I know that it picks up points from all the pixels and then it illuminates them based on a light value. So you have to render with much significantly higher settings with an HDRI image to be able to illuminate properly. So in this case, it wouldn't save time, it would add additional time with not a significant benefit, because if we go back to see the renderings, we barely perceive the external world. In fact, most of the cases it's a lot more overexposed. Hello, Toro. Yeah, so with the frames, again, they have some very simple materials. They're separated, so we have the wood, we have the photo, which is literally just an element, and I've created a glass element that sits on top of it, so it gives a bit more reflections. This is City Hall in Philadelphia. If you're not familiar with it, it was shot from a helicopter. Very beautiful scene. Again, it's my sister's, in case you want to buy it. I don't know if she even sells it somewhere. Just a thought. And then, yeah, with the desk, the idea was that if we have some creative angle at one point, it was from over here. We wanted to have some photos that look like a working desk, and you have a sense when we're presenting the project to the client. Okay, so to go back to the presentation, as you can see, the final result, if you can call it that, and in fact maybe you have a different preference than the ones I do, which are typically the last image of the series, but they took a series of iterations to get to the right place. Now, that iteration requires a lot of refinement. So the typical design process is sketch, and having really strong ideas prior to coming into 3D. Like in this case, there were a series of sketches and a series of more sketches that came afterwards, and then iterate, refine, step back and refine again. Here's my little cheat sheet, which explains those things, which for me it's basically, it is the basis for any design, no matter how simple or complex. For example, yesterday, it's in the same presentation stack, I was talking about this theater, which at first hand it seems a lot more complex, but in reality the process is exactly the same. It's just what you're used to and what your clients desire. Okay, so thanks very much for this. Let me know what you think of it. Again, it's a little bit different because it's a very small scale. In reality, I want to get a lot more in front of the camera, so I want to talk about a lot of my previous projects. So there's going to be a lot more coming up with this. This is probably the only interior one that I've done. I think that's probably good for everybody, including you and me. But do give the thumbs up if you like this video and consider subscribing. Also, let me know if you would like to see something specific. I'm definitely open to requests about how to use Blender for architectural design. Thanks again for tuning in, and see you next time.